Okay, good morning. That's a picture taken in 2006 of the campus of the University of Kansas. And I lived in this dorm back here, McCullum Hall, from 1966 to early 1968. The married student housing was there, and these were some of the other halls. McCullum has been torn down. I don't know uh, whether the others are still up or not. And I'll just show you. Here's a picture from William and Mary where I been expelled in 1961. I've talked about that a lot. But let me get on to today's talk, and I want to continue. Looks like I with where I left off yesterday about talking about skin in the game and normativity, and when it comes to particularly comes to personal freedom and sexuality and gender and these kinds of things, and also just your personal agency in the world about the relationship between ex- directing your life as your own person and actually being a benefit to others. That balance, which is real important. Um, I just mentioned also the skin in the game is the name of a book and published in 2018 by NASA Nicholas Talib. I had reviewed it in the past, and it's on one of my other sites to review. Um, And I did in the previous video, I didn't mention the Second Amendment particularly. You could say that men ought to be proficient in protecting families with firearms, legally owned firearms in the state that you live in, of course, and being over a certain age and so forth. If you wanted to, that's a legitimate argument. I didn't make that yesterday, but I made a comment on yesterday's post that talks about that a little bit. So, but anyway, why don't I have any dependents? Myself, I was born in 1943. I'm 80 years old now. What made me tick when I was younger? Well, my background was that I was behind other male peers. I became very aware of this in about third grade, about the same time I started taking piano. My third grade teacher was really adamant about this, about my keeping up with other boys, and I didn't. My particularly have problems with my controlling my sense of space when in a fluid, like swimming or tumbling in the air. And I also didn't have the strength. And I was kind of a pariah on the playground. There was the no bunts except for Bushka thing when we played kickball or softball or something. Although I got better at that as time went by, particularly during puberty. Um, But I was very good. Became a very good student later in grade school, and particularly by middle school. And I was very much into critical thinking and questioning things and sort of attracting attention to myself for my ability to do that sometimes. I was also somewhat hypochondriac. And the measles might have been the reason for some of this. I had the measles when I was before my seventh birthday. And the measles was in 1950 is known to affect people neurologically. So they may have had nothing to do with chromosomes or SRYs or anything else. It may have been, um, excuse me, my problems. It wasn't a DSD. It may have been an infectious disease. Um, Now, let me just talk about what triggers being aroused by men who have certain secondary sex characteristics and a certain way of appearing. I'd call it upward affiliation. This term right here, which is a term that George Gilder used to like to use when he wrote Sexual Suicide in 1973, and when he wrote Men in Marriage in 1986. Um, and wanting to be affiliated with somebody, with a young male adult who is superior in all ways, both a good student and both a good athlete, and who looks masculine. I'm the perfect male, sort of the Clark Kent in Smallville or something, but somebody who looks and acts perfectly masculine is perfect in all ways. So it's a sort of kind of vicarious identification, but it's not the same thing as gender identity. Um, Now, once I feel that way about, I have that kind of a connection with someone, I would tend to then have more normal social relationships with others that were more ordinary. I did not feel attracted to very many people, very, very few, which my father didn't understand when, after the William and Mary thing happened in 1961. He thought that meant you were attracted to all men. No, very, very few, extremely selective, which is actually an issue because in and was an issue when I was a patient at NIH in 1962. And I was very dismissive of some of the other patients who weren't as intact. There's a fear that if someone becomes privileged and even moderately conspicuous over time, that this attitude will scale up. And if a lot of people do it, the same thing, that are in a position like mine, you'll start moving towards fascism, and only viewing people as expendable unless they aren't fit, which is kind of partly what happened in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, particularly Germany and to a lesser extent Italy. So we've been there before. This is a dangerous idea. Um, Now, this would contribute to the desire by activists to um, replace in our public policy biological sex, the two, binary sex, in other words, based on just two basic sexes for large gametes and small gametes, with a gender ID self identity. And that makes it easier for young people, particularly in younger grades in school, like I was in third grade, who don't do well according to the norms for their biological sex, which is nearly always, almost 100% of the time, not in doubt. Very few, extremely few kids have DSDs. Most of the people that are claiming to have other gender identities are biologically normal. And that's something we don't say often enough. But it will also lead to the idea that even refusing to date unattractive people, even in the heterosexual world, excuse me, is unethical. And there used to be an idea: is that the best somebody can do, even in the heterosexual world? The kind of girl a guy could get, that was a measure of his effectiveness back in even in the heterosexual world. And I would hear people said a lot in the 1980s when I was in Texas too. People would say that in the office is kind of cruel, but they did. Um, Now, heterosexual men and animals, and including man, seems to be heavily instinctual. Um, And it seems to be related to the idea of preserving one's genes as a kind of vicarious immortality. You know, and even if we do, unless civilization goes to other solar systems eventually, or at least, or Mars or something, Earth is going to fail someday. The sun will expand and get too hot, and if a civilization is really going to last forever, it's got to be able to get past the speed of light. I mean, that's good for science fiction, or people will have to be on spaceships and live inside of O'Neill cylinders and with Albuquerque drives or something for years, and reproduce themselves. You can imagine science fiction scenarios in the future. That sounds like a nice movie idea, doesn't it? In the pictures below, I showed you the KU dorm, and then 4 years earlier, William and Mary. Now, even at KU, I was older. I was 22 and 23 then, and I knew to keep my mouth shut. But even then, a lot of young men would talk about women, and it's something they had a right to have, and their instinct. About 80% of men in a college dorm seemed to talk that way. Although it was not quite as crass. in the middle 60s at the University of Kansas as it was in the dorm at William and Mary in 1961. Things had started to improve a little bit with the civil rights movement, and behavior was starting to get a little bit better. By the way, dorms at KU had hours for women, but not for men. And that's kind of interesting back in the 60s. Now, epigenetic prenatal influence may be very well be relevant, and it's well known. It's pretty well accepted by research today that latter-born sons of the same mother are more likely to turn out to be gay, at least as adults. And that seems to be. Now, I was an only child. I had another reason. Maybe it had to deal with measles, or there's something else that has to explain my neurodivergence. But typically, you often say latter-born sons are supposed to be there for the family. They're the backup. Latter-born sons could be extra warriors to protect the family. And it's sort of nature's way of making population reasonable, not having enough children, but not having too many. But in some families, it's very strong. A lot of people on my mother's side of the family didn't have very many children, both men and women. And it seems like that was a pattern in my, not on my father's side so much, but on my mother's side. Now, the brain, what I think happens if somebody does not have this instinct, this reproductive instinct, like lions have. In fact, lions will kill other males, the cubs of other male lions, in order to propagate their own genes. It gets brutal in nature, but anyway, if your brain attaches esoteric significance to secondary sex characteristics, and there's this kind of a bridge between almost the supernatural and the world you can control. There's almost like your consciousness and and your awareness of what turns you on, it still affects your consciousness and your senses. It's almost like the mathematics of consciousness is not complete. There are too many partial differential equations describing it, and there's no common solution to all of them. So your consciousness and your agency as a person to make decisions not just depend on, downloaded to you as a person, not just dependent on God or the universe or something, but downloaded to your consciousness is what makes up for the incompleteness of the math of what turns you on. Because some of it's mathematical, binary sexes, but in all species is driven by basically statistics, because it works statistically to help species adjust to changing environment. So that's why we have practically every nucleated and cell system has binary sex. So we talked about the altruistic aspect. In my case, I didn't stay, I did come back and have to take care of my mother after 2003. And so the filial responsibility issue did come back, but I had a very independent life. So I actually competed with people who had kids and had to take on bigger debt, buy bigger houses and bigger cars and so forth, SUVs and so forth than I did. I had lower cost of living and was paid essentially the same, although sometimes I did more on-call duty without being paid for it because other people had kids. So I wasn't paid quite as much per hour because I did more free work because I didn't have kids. But I was actually financially sounder than most of my coworkers. Because in a sense I was competing with them, although in a minor way cooperating with them. That's how it was, particularly in the 1990s, which was when I wrote the books. Now, the other part of this is that men are expected to develop a long-term intimate relationship with one partner, preferably heterosexual, with whom they had children. But sometimes it might be a same-sex couple adopting children or various other arrangements. And learning, there's this idea that everyone should learn to take care of children, even if they didn't have their own children. there's this idea that women tame men, but also nurturing people tend to tame aggressive people, even in the gay world. That tends to happen with the polarities. But the idea of having a permanent relationship, to raise kids did feed the idea of no sex before marriage, even no sexual fantasies or masturbation before marriage, if you were strict enough in your religion. And that the idea that men had a sex-based duty to protect women. And so this idea that men had a basis to a duty to protect women who in older days took a lot of risks when they had children, because childbearing used to be very risky in older days. Um, so kind of compensated was justifying the idea of conscription of men only, which of course back in the flared up during the Vietnam era. And it was also connected with the idea of sacrifice, that some people would be sacrificed for the good of everybody else. And we would honor their sacrifices as fallen heroes or something. But a lot of people felt that was personally dishonorable to let them happen to them. There were people, even in the dorm at KU in the mid-60s, when the draft was becoming heavy, who said they didn't want to be, if they got drafted and got killed in Vietnam, they didn't want to be honored for doing that. I even heard people say that. I sort of thought that. Now, all this kind of chain-linked ideology, there used to be this idea that you had to get all men to try to have children, and you had to prohibit everything outside of the heterosexual world, even marginal boys, feminine boys, like the various books like Growing Up Straight and so forth. And, they would urge parents to push their more marginal boys into masculine pursuits, like using my parents did. And since some boys fail in this setup, there's an incentive to welcome ideas like gender ideology today, which would reduce the pressure on kids, although not set them up for the medicalization and all the stuff that may happen, that they're allowed to say or to think of themselves as non-binary, something that may not work out very well for them later in life. How are they going to find partners? I just thought I would also note that we talked about resuming conscription after 9/11. Charles Moscos, remember, had helped design the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Excuse me, got a scratchy throat. I'm going to even go out on a limb and say we need to change the selective service law now and simply require all adults 18 to 25, including biological females or whatever somebody thinks they are, the requirement to register, given the instability of the world with Ukraine and Israel and Russia and China, maybe in China and Taiwan and everything else that could happen. I think we should require everybody. I'm just going to go right out and say that right now. Now, my education did keep me out of Vietnam when I was drafted, and that's a big part of my story in the Do As Do Tell book and possibly movie proposal. And until 1969, remember, student deferments had been a big moral issue. It was school was a way to weed out people, and it was regarded you were more fit if you were smarter, and you deserved to be protected from being sent to infantry in Vietnam. That was the way people thought. It sounds like survival of the fittest. I mean, that's kind of how people thought then. And even with a supposedly liberal president like Johnson, who wasn't really very liberal. Well, he was liberal on race, but he was very mixed in his opinion. I was on KP the night that he announced he wouldn't run in the middle of special training company. I remember that. Married men used to be deferred, but Johnson took away their deferments in August of 1965. And if you had at least one child, you could be deferred. Although when I was in basic training, there were numerous married men that had children, and allotments were sent to their spouses. Johnson had at one time not wanted to go get involved in Vietnam and said that Asian boys could carry the burden. That's something that's shown at the Marine Corps Museum, by the way. But he went back on that. That was a very nasty quote from him that came back to haunt him later. But anyway, the other point of this is this all makes heterosexual marriage with children normative behavior and includes the idea of complementarity. And it means that even though a lot of us won't be able to do that and marry, we kind of have to have some respect for the idea that it's important that most people or many people do that to keep civilization going. Um, and the eligibility to serve in the military, which and the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2011 did help gay men, particularly, or masculine gay men that you see in more masculine bars like the Bunker in Washington or something. It made gay men seem like part of the establishment, sort of more normative, part of normativity themselves. That was an important idea in my mind. There's nothing wrong with having notions of normativity in order to prevent society from being torn toward extremism. Um, Now, I'd just add that yeah, you can imagine assigning people genders and pronouns and or salutations like Mr. and Mrs. like we grew up with, based on the variety of personal temperaments, Paul Rosenfeld's or the performativities of Judith Butler. It could even include 9 binary categories, but there's a danger that an authoritarian communist society would come along and say, if you didn't have children as a male, you were a different label. They could actually separate people like some indigenous societies do now and regulate your behavior, which I don't think that's a good idea. The left remember, is very offended when people say they don't date people that aren't normative or that aren't attractive. But again, this setup can become dystopian. So somebody like me with an intimate connection to a family could reasonably be expected to show willingness to bond with individuals who are non-normative. That would be, and do this personally. I remember a youth sermon about this in 2012 at a Presbyterian church here in Arlington. It actually gets very personal and not out of group allyship or, the way the left presents the demands for allyship and anti-racism and anti-everything else. Without these expectations somehow being enforced, society could slowly slip back toward fascism. This kind of grows against the grain of encouraging individual initiative among young adults. And remember, a return of the draft could mean that young adults who became teenagers today online as entrepreneurs wouldn't have the opportunity to continue to do so like they used to. That's something to think about. So that's kind of what I wanted to say today. I would also just say it was what happened in 2022, when Roe versus Wade was reversed. My own idea is that you can respect unborn life to be once it's sentient, and that's thought to be at about 12 or 13 weeks. That's just where I think the line should be drawn. Now, I don't place any value in belonging to a group claiming to be the oppressed. And that means nothing at all to me. I want to own the significance of my own choices myself, and that's very important to me. So that's what I have for this episode, and I'll have 1 or 2 more episodes, talk about a couple of other things, particularly about age verification and book selling and a few other things pretty soon. So I do thank you for listening.